Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are located on the globe. My name is Chana Galai, and I'm the academic director of the Naomi Prawer Kadar International Yiddish Summer Program. And I am here with my partner in crime, Professor Justin Cami of Smith College, who is the on-site summer director. I am, needless to say, at Tel Aviv University, both in terms of where I work and where I am physically located at this very moment. Our summer program got off to a wonderful start this morning with a really great, wonderful group of students from all over the world. Some of them are here with us in Tel Aviv, and some of them are learning from a distance from England, from Romania, from Vienna, Austria, from the United States. And beyond the diversity of our students, we always take pride in the rigor of our language education and also the range of afternoon activities that we offer. And the Naomi Prawer Kadar Memorial Lecture is always our keynote lecture of the summer. And we start this way with a great master of Yiddish culture, and Professor Sam Kassow is most definitely a master of Yiddish culture, and we are extremely lucky to have this lecture with him today. Sam teaches, I can call him Sam, I'm lucky to call him a friend. Professor Kassow teaches at Trinity College, where he is the Charles H. Northam Professor of History. And Professor Kassow likely needs almost no introduction, but nonetheless, his life story is worth hearing again. He was born in a German displaced persons camp, and he is a native speaker of Yiddish, and it's a shame that wir werden reden auf English dosmo, but maybe another time we can have Professor Kassow back and have an event in Yiddish with him. He received his BA from Trinity College, his MS from the London School of Economics, and his PhD from Princeton University. Aside from his position at Trinity College, Professor Kassow has also taught at Harvard University. He's taught here as part of the summer program. He's taught at the University of Chicago, at Princeton, JTS, Wesleyan, Hebrew U, UConn, and that's just to name a few. Among his long list of books, Professor Kassow has published Students, Professors, and the State in Tsarist Russia from 1989, The Distinctive Life of East European Jewry, 2004. He edited with Professor Roski's Catastrophe and Rebirth, which is of the Posen Anthology of Modern Jewish Culture. Listen and Believe, the ghetto reportage of Peretz Opochinsky and Yosef Zelkovich, and actually taught from this book this year. So some of my students know this book really well. And most famously, most well known, a book that has not only earned scholarly acclaim, but has really changed popular consciousness about the Holocaust. And that is Who Will Write Our History? Emanuel Ringelblum and the Oynig Shabbos Archive, which has actually been not only been the recipient of many prestigious awards, but it's also been made into a film. I wanted to say something personal about this book by Professor Kassow. This is a book that's changed the field. It's also changed my life, my research. The basic idea that he presents there is an incredibly powerful one. And that is that East European Jews, Yiddish speakers, were conscious of the need to testify to the Holocaust as it was happening in real time, and that they had cultural tools, they had intellectual resources, even if those intellectual resources were challenged and strained under Holocaust conditions, they had the resources to know the importance, to understand the importance of testimony and writing history. And Professor Kassow has been helpful to me many times. He gives me one small tip about one little word or one little footnote or one sentence that he remembers reading. Oh, you have to open up page 78 of Peretz Opochinsky's handwritten diary. And of course I open it up and it has exactly what I need. And Professor Kassow has been a mentor like this for a great many young scholars. So for all of these reasons, I'm extremely pleased to have him with us today. He joins other prestigious Naomi Kadar lecturers from the past, such as David Roskis, Nancy Sinkov, Mark Kaplan, Jack Kugelmass, Ellie Lederhendler, Nama Sandro, Nomi Seidman, and Eddie Portnoy. Professor Kassow's lecture today is entitled Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum, Historian and Fighter. Sam, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so glad to have the chance to talk to you all. I wish I were in Israel in person, but hopefully I'll get my chance to come back to Israel sooner rather than later. I'm talking today about one of the most successful examples of what is now commonly called cultural resistance during the Holocaust. That is the secret Oynik Shabbos archive organized in the Warsaw Ghetto by the historian Emanuel Ringelblum. And again, I want to remind you that had it not been for that archive, we would not be able to study the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto as individuals, as members of a community. We would not be able to look at the underground press. We would not have had the amazing writings of the Piaseczner Rebbe. We would not have had all the diaries. We would have been forced to simply use German sources, study the history of the perpetrators, use survivor memoirs, which have their own limitations. Because of this, the Jewish victims are remembered as people, as individuals, and not as an anonymous mass without name and without identity. So this is vital, and Ringelblum knew this at the time. And even if only a part of the archive was retrieved, in this, he won a posthumous victory. So I'm going to start this lecture by referring to a letter that Ringelblum wrote on March 1st, 1944, just 1 week before the Germans caught him and murdered him, his wife, son, and 34 other Jews. So this is one of the last letters he ever wrote. And he wrote it to a close friend of his, Adolf Berman, who later became a major figure in the Mapam party in Israel. But like Ringelblum, Adolf Berman was also in a hideout on the Aryan side of German-occupied Warsaw. And in this letter, Ringelblum asked a question. He said, what if we're caught? What if neither of us survives? What will happen to the OS? The OS was code for the Oynik Shabbos, which was code for that archive. And it showed you, of course, how important secrecy was, how important it was to keep the existence of that archive a secret from the Germans. And Ringelblum had good reason to worry, because by the time the war was over, of the 60 or so people that he had involved in this amazing documentation project, there were only 3 survivors. And of the 3 survivors, only one, Hirschwasser, knew where the archive had been buried. That is under the Yiddish school in the Warsaw Ghetto, on Novolipki 68. Wasser himself had survived by the slimmest of margins, once actually jumping from a train that was taking him to Treblinka. The other two survivors were Wasser's wife and, of course, the amazing journalist and Yad Vashem activist Rochel Auerbach, whose memoirs I'm now translating from Yiddish into English. In 1945 and 46, Auerbach and Hirschwasser, they cajoled, they nagged, they buttonholed everybody they could find, trying to get people to start looking for what Auerbach called that great treasure that was now buried under the ruins of Warsaw. But if anybody knows what Warsaw looked like in 1945 and 1946, they would know that it was just one big mass of rubble. That is, after the ghetto uprising of April 1943, and then the Polish uprising of August to September 1944, where 200,000 Poles died, and where the Germans then leveled what was left of the city to say, well, yeah, we buried the archive under the ruins of Novolipki 68. Given the rubble, it was hard to know where a street had been, much less where a building had been. I'm just going to try to do a share screen now. Is that okay? Taxing my technological skill. Okay. Share screen. Here we go. This is what the area looked like in 1946. These are two leaders of the American Joint Distribution Committee, and finally, the Joint Distribution Committee, the Jewish Labor Committee, gave some money. And they hired a team of surveyors and engineers, and they started what could only be called an archaeological expedition. Now, using the spire of a half-destroyed church, and you see that spire in the distance, and using pre-war aerial photographs, they were kind of able to pinpoint where in the rubble Novolipki 68 must have been. And they started digging, and on September 18th, 1946, a shovel tapped what turned out to be the first of 10 tin boxes, i.e. the first cache of the Ringelblum archive, which had been buried on August 3rd, 1942. And here we see Michael Borvich, the guy in the mustache, handing over one of those tin boxes. Can you all see this picture? To Hirschwasser, whose back is to the camera. Now, I said that Wasser survived by a very thin margin. Well, Michael Borvich, who played a major role in Holocaust historiography after the war, writing many books, you might say that Borvich survived by an even thinner margin, because in the Janowska labor camp in Lviv in 1943, he was actually hanged. But the rope broke, and the SS man supervising the execution being an educated gentleman, an alumnus of either Heidelberg or Marburg, or as so many SS men were, he didn't believe in hanging people twice. And Borovich was sent back to the barrack, and then he was able to escape. Now, at that point, they couldn't find more than 10 tin boxes. And Wasser said, wait a minute, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We buried a lot more than that. Keep looking. But they kept looking. They couldn't find any more. And unfortunately, in the course of the 3 years that those boxes had been buried, a lot of water had seeped in. So many documents were ruined, especially those written in ink, and many photographs were ruined. Of the hundreds and hundreds of photographs that the Oynik Shabbos archive took in a conscious effort to use the camera as a counter weapon to hit back against German use of camera and film as a tool to show Jews as depraved parasites. Many of these photographs were ruined and only about 70 survived. This first cache dealt with the activities of the Oynik Shabbos archive up to August 1942. Now, in the next couple of years, Wasser, Basha, Bluma Wasser, Rochel Auerbach, Philip Friedman, Michal Borovich, that whole crew, Joseph Kermish, that whole crew of historians who had pioneered Holocaust research in Poland right after the war, seeing that Poland was becoming a Stalinist totalitarian country, they picked up and left. And time went by, and then in December 1950, 4 years later, Polish construction workers who were here you see Wasser and Rochel Auerbach. So in December 1950, Polish construction workers who were building new apartment houses on the ruins of the old Warsaw Ghetto, they stumbled on 2 aluminum milk cans, and their eyes lit up, because you know that all these Jews were stuffed with dollars and diamonds and gold. And after the war, all over Poland, people were engaged in a treasure hunt. They even went to Treblinka and to Belzec to dig up the ground to find this Jewish gold. And imagine the disappointment of these Polish construction workers when they discovered that in these aluminum milk cans were not valuables, but were documents, papers. And they were going to junk the whole find, just simply throw it away. But just then, the foreman, Wojciech, who had been on a lunch break, came back and said, no, this is Jewish stuff, and we have to hand it over to the Jewish Historical Institute. And thanks to the foreman coming back from lunch, we have the second cache of the Ringelblum archive, which covers the period from August 1942 to the end of February 1943, and which was buried either at the end of February 1943 or at the beginning of March. Now, according to Hirsch-Wasser, there is also a third cache. According to Hirsch-Wasser, they buried a third cache of the archive. In April 1943, just a week before the outbreak of the ghetto uprising, they buried this under the brushmaker's shop on Świętojańska 34, which during the uprising was the scene of very heavy fighting. There was a detachment of the Jewish fighting organization led by Marek Edelman, a well-known Bundist, and the site was totally leveled. After the war, this address, Świętojarskie 34, became the site of the Chinese embassy in Poland, and it's still the Chinese embassy. And many years ago, a team of Israeli searchers asked the Chinese for permission to start digging under their embassy in an attempt to find, if possible, this third cache of the Ringelblum archive. The Chinese said yes, and they dug and dug, but they couldn't find very much. They found a rusty pistol, and that was it. So this third cache, if it had indeed been buried, was never found. So as you could see from what I've said so far, a lot of the archive was lost forever. Nonetheless, we have usable 25 to 30,000 documents. Just recently, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw completed the publication of the entire extant archive. It ran to 36 volumes. So it shows you the enormous amount that was recovered and that we can use. Now, why is this important? The great Jewish historian Isaac Schipper, who was one of Emanuel Ringelblum's teachers, said to a fellow inmate in Majdanek in 1943, a short time before he was murdered, he said, "What we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them." Ringelblum was determined to make sure that after the Jews were murdered, nevertheless, their voice would be heard, that there would be buried time capsules that would speak from beyond the grave. And that explains the title that I chose for my book, Who Will Write Our History? The Germans thought that they would win the war, and they would decide how the Jews would be remembered. And the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, of course, had no illusions about how they would be portrayed for posterity. They saw the German film crews. They saw the Nazi propaganda films like The Eternal Jew, which compared Jews to rats and to vermin. And Ringelblum was determined that the Jews would be remembered on the basis of Jewish and not German documents. Now, to write, to keep diaries, to keep an archive going, this was a sign of amazing optimism. Remember the fact that 80% of Polish Jewry was murdered in 1942. That is, most Polish Jews went to their deaths at a time when the Germans were winning the war. In order to write, you had to believe that the Germans were going to lose the war. Otherwise, why bother? And this is a testimony, not just to their covenant that they made with future Jewish generations, but it's a testimony to their inborn optimism. And think of it this way. Today, looking at the scholarship of the Warsaw Ghetto, we see an enormous number of wonderful books. Javi Dreyfus, Israel Gutman, Olav Hashalom, Basha Engelking, Jacek Liochak, and more and more and more. We have a number of works on the Piaseczner Rebbe. Yad Vashem has published 3,600 pages of the Jewish underground press in the Warsaw Ghetto, 3,600 pages. None of this would have been possible without the Oyneg Shabbos archive. So in short, we see that Jews resisted, not just with guns, because very few had guns, but Jews could resist with paper and pen. And they did so everywhere. It's said, we don't know if this is true or not, but it's said that just before he was murdered in Riga in December 1941, the great East European Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov yelled out, Jeden verschreibt, Jews, write it all down. In the ruins of crematorium number 3 in Auschwitz-Birkenau, after the war, glass bottles surfaced, filled with the writings of a member of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando, Zalman Gradowski. And one of his amazing essays on the Czech transport is included in David Roski's anthology, The Literature of Destruction. Think about it. You're in the Sonderkommando. You're literally working in the gas chambers. You're burning bodies, and at night you write for posterity. In the Vilna Ghetto, we found the hundreds and hundreds of pages of the diary of Hermann Kruk, the librarian of the Vilna Ghetto, a diary that was continued in Estonia. The last diary entry was made only 4 hours before he was murdered. Yale University Press published this in an anthology, in a translation of Barbara Binyamin Harshav. In a death cell in Krakow's Montepeluch prison, a young Jewish woman, Justinia Dranger, wrote an amazing journal on toilet paper and rolled that up and gave it to somebody to hide. And this too was preserved and published in translation by University of Massachusetts Press. There were also ghetto archives in Bialystok, in Vilna, in Lodz. But the biggest ghetto archive, the most elaborate, was the Oyneg Shabbos archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was different from the other ghetto archives in many ways. First of all, it was a collective. As I said, 60 people, rabbis like Shimon Huberbaum, communists like Yehuda Feld, Zionists like Lipa Bloch, men and women, the well-known and the not so well-known, a group of 60 who Ringelblum said came together, putting aside party differences in a sense of national mission and national responsibility. The archive was also very well organized. There was an executive committee that met every Saturday afternoon, and they charted strategy. They charted that they decided whom to recruit, what topics to start studying. They raised money. There was a team of interviewers who risked their lives to go into the refugee centers in the Warsaw Ghetto and get information from the shtetls and cities outside of Warsaw, from the 100,000 refugees dumped into the ghetto. Why do I say they risked their lives? Because these were the flashpoints of the typhus pandemic. Many of the refugees were infested with lice, and many of these interviewers got sick, and a number of them died, and yet they did their job. And we have reports in the archive from over 400 different localities. Therefore, the Oynik Shabbos archive is giving us information not just about Warsaw, but about what was going on all over Poland. There were also copiers because, as you know, Ringelblum did not have Xerox machines to make copies of all the documents. And so there was a group of people who just laboriously rewrote every document by hand, hoping therefore to increase the chances that some documents would be preserved. And then there was what I would call a technical group. This technical group consisted of a teacher in the Yiddish schools, Israel Lichtenstein, and two teenage boys. Only they had possession of the physical documents, the physical materials as they were coming into the archives. So only those three, plus the two secretaries of the archive, Hirschwasser and Eliyahu Gutkovsky, plus Ringelblum, that is a total of 6 people. Only 6 people knew where the documents were at any given time. This in an effort to ensure secrecy. The Oynik Shabbos archive also differed from the other ghetto archives in its independence from the Judenrat. Ringelblum did not trust the Judenrat and tried to keep a wide berth. One of the reasons why the Oynik Shabbos archive was so effective and so successful is that it was embedded into a much bigger organization in the Warsaw Ghetto called the Alleinhilfe, or the Self-Help. The Self-Help ran a network of soup kitchens, schools, refugee centers. It was financed in large part by the American Joint Distribution Committee. Being an American organization and remembering that the US and Germany were not at war until Pearl Harbor in December 1941, this gave the Self-Help a kind of a quasi-legal status, and the Germans were happy to continue this because they were getting a great exchange rate on American dollars. The leadership of the Joint Distribution Committee in the Warsaw Ghetto was basically the same as the leadership of the Oynik Shabbos archive. The Self-Help also rested on a foundation of more than 1,200 house committees in the Warsaw Ghetto. Think of this, 1,200 house committees. Almost every building in the ghetto had a committee. They elected a kind of a house committee parliament, which was run by Emanuel Ringelblum. And these house committees were also a very vital source of information that was flowing into the archive. So the archive could use the Self-Help for money, for paper, for ink, to pay certain minimal salaries to the collaborators. Now, the Oynik Shabbos archive also stood out for the sheer ambition of its agenda. The first agenda item, which began when the archive was started in 1940 and which continued right up until the end, was to sammle, to collect stuff. They collected candy wrappers. They collected theater tickets. They collected the menus of the fancy restaurants in the Warsaw Ghetto, where Jews with money, like smugglers and policemen, could gorge themselves on fancy meals. They collected the children's essays from June 1942, just shortly before their murder, where kids engaged in a ghetto-wide contest and wrote essays in Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew on what we want to do when the war is over. And it also shows you, again, that Ringelblum before the war was a historian, and he had a great interest in material culture. In 1941, the archive decided to undertake a very ambitious study project. It was called 2 Years of Ghetto. It was an attempt to study Polish Jewish society under the German occupation. It had more than 80 research topics: women under the occupation, children, corruption, religious life, Polish-Jewish relations, German-Jewish relations. Each topic had a team leader who would draft guidelines, develop questionnaires, decide how the topic would be approached. Some members of the Oyneg Shabbos were team leaders of 4 or 5 different topics at once. We see here that this is no more and no less than a continuation of the YIVO study agenda now taken into the Warsaw Ghetto. Before the war, leaders of the Oyneg Shabbos archive, like Emanuel Ringelblum, were key figures in the YIVO based in Vilna. And this YIVO emphasis on studying Jewish life in real time, as Max Weinreich said, "zu erkennen dem Heint," to learn about the Jewish everyday through questionnaires, through interviews, through attention to material culture, through the study of young people, encouraging ordinary Jews to write about themselves, encourage ordinary Jews to research the history of their shtetls. This was all carried over into the Oyneg Shabbos archive. And this was slated to result in a book of 1,600 pages. Unfortunately, this whole project was in full swing when on July 22nd, 1942, the mass murder of the Warsaw Jews began. The last week of July, as the Jewish police were rounding up 7,000 Jews a day and taking them to the boxcars on their way to Treblinka, Ringelblum ordered his secretaries to roam through the ghetto and tell every collaborator to hand over their notes, their unfinished essays, all their materials, just hand it over. There was no time to lose. And this material was a very important part of what was found in the 10 tin boxes in 1946. Once the mass murder began in July 1942, the Oyneg Shabbos crossed a Rubicon. This was a time of real crisis. During those summer months, Ringelblum could barely finish a sentence. His handwriting changed. We could see that he was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Everybody was living in fear. Ringelblum was torn between his sense of responsibility to the archive and his natural desire as a father and husband to go into hiding and try to shelter his wife and son. During those terrible summer months, the numbers of workers in the Oyneg Shabbos decreased from 60 to 50 to 40 to 30. Every day, a member of the Oyneg Shabbos came home, quote unquote, to find that loved ones had been taken away. Rabbi Shimon Huberband was taken away. Avram Levin came home to find that his beloved wife had been taken away. And in shock, he changed the language of his diary from Yiddish to Hebrew to kind of turn his diary now into a chronicle in covenantal time. And you could ask yourself, as their world was now crashing down all around them, why did they bother to keep on working? Why did they bother to keep on going? A partial answer to this question can be found in an unfinished essay in one of the milk cans. This unfinished essay was written by a woman named Gustawa Jarecka. Gustawa Jarecka wrote in Polish. She had been a leftist in the Polish Socialist Party before the war. She was a stenographer in the Judenrat, and she had a Judenrat pass. And because of that, Ringelblum thought that she would be immune from the roundups. And he asked her to walk through the streets of the ghetto and observe the roundups and write down what she saw for the archive. And she managed to finish only the first part of her essay before she and her two kids were taken to Treblinka. But in part, here's what she wrote. She said, how could we Jews have been blamed for thinking that the story of human history is a story of progress, is a story of progress from savagery to decency? This is what we were taught in the Bible. How could we have known that in the summer of 1942, the most educated, the most cultured nation in Europe would be murdering children? How could we have known that the wheel of history was in fact rolling in the opposite direction, from decency to savagery? And if that is indeed the case, then hopefully these writings that I'm doing now, that these writings, and now I'm quoting her directly, will be like a stone under history's wheel, like a stone under history's wheel, meaning someday people will find what I'm writing and they'll say, oh my God, how could this have happened? How could people have allowed this to happen? Let's make sure that such mass murder never happens again. During the course of 1942, 6 or 7 Jews arrived in the Warsaw Ghetto who had escaped from the death camps. One escapee from Chelmno in February 1942, and then 5 or 6 escapees from Treblinka. The Oynik Shabbos took down all their testimonies. Rachel Auerbach sat for weeks with one of the escapees from Treblinka, Avram Kshapitsky, who'd been in Treblinka for 11 days. And the typed record of that interview in Yiddish comes to about 100 pages. And the interview was so detailed that even as Treblinka was working at full steam, the Oynik Shabbos learned about the physical layout of the camp. They learned that the tiles inside the gas chambers were orange, and so on and so forth. Based on these accounts and based on eyewitness testimonies from other towns, during the course of 1942, the Oynik Shabbos sent 4 detailed reports to London, to the Polish government in exile in London, working together with the Bund and using the channels of the Polish underground. All of these accounts reached their destination. And finally, at the very end, Ringelblum, Wasser, Gutkowski, Gittermann helped to raise money to buy weapons for the Jewish Fighting Organization. The last item on the agenda was to raise the money for armed resistance. Ringelblum's watchword was zu verschreiben und zu verschreiben nach der heißen Minute. Write everything down, but write everything down immediately as you see it. Don't say, I'm going to do it next week. Don't say, I'm going to do it when I have time. Don't say, well, what I saw today, I'm not sure I'll write about it because it's not important. In the conditions of the ghetto and the war, you don't know if you'll be alive tomorrow, or you don't know if you'll see something so horrible that you will be a different person tomorrow from what you were today. Everything is important, and right within the event, right in real time. As a trained historian, Ringelblum instinctively understood the difference between real-time testimony from people living within a community that is not yet destroyed, that still has some sparks of life going on. The difference between real-time testimony and post-war survivor testimony, where the perspective of the survivor is going to be very different. The survivor knows the story. He knows what happened. Post-war survivor testimony is going to focus on very different issues. Post-war survivors are not going to pay much attention to what happened in the ghetto. The ghettos will shrink in the imagination to becoming mere antechambers, mere holding pens for the gas chambers, rather than continuations of pre-war Jewish communities. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The Einig Shabbos collaborator who Ringelblum entrusted with doing the study of Jewish women under the German occupation was a woman named Cecilia Slapakova. She was very, very dedicated, very energetic, and she had actually finished a lot of her study by May 1942. She interviewed all kinds of Jewish women, from a woman with a PhD in biology to a librarian, to a middle-class woman who was now supporting her family by running a brothel, all the way to women who survived by smuggling in vegetables. And then she wrote an introductory essay about the Jewish woman in the war. And she said, the war has shown that Jewish women are psychologically tougher than men, that they don't become as prone to depression and apathy. As the ghetto has dragged on, the task of maintaining the soup kitchens, for example, the house committees, has fallen more and more on the shoulders of women. And this means, she said, this means that after the war, I am sure that the Jewish woman in the Warsaw Ghetto that the Jewish woman in Poland after the war will not let herself be pushed back into the kitchen. She will demand a seat at the table. Then, of course, Slapakova and her 5-year-old daughter were murdered in Treblinka. Her husband survived. But let's imagine that Slapakova had survived the war, that she'd settled in Boston. That's like so many survivors, she found a new mate in the DP camps and started a second family, comes to the United States, and her grandchildren are saying, Bubby, why don't you write your memoirs? Now, had she written her memoirs based on her post-war personality and memory, the ghetto would have become nothing more than an antechamber, than a holding pen. She would have totally forgotten that at some point she was waxing lyrical about the prospects for Jewish women in post-war Poland. She would have written about how she survived. She would have written about the camps. She would have written about the miracles of survival. But we wouldn't have known the thoughts, the hopes, the dreams, the illusions of Polish Jewry in the very last chapter. Now, thanks to the Einig Shabbos archive, we have the different voices of Polish Jewry at the very end, the children writing about what I want to be after the war, the Piaseczner Rebbe, the ordinary notation of a Mrs. Kaplan, describing how there's a meeting of her house committee And Mrs. Weinberg and Mrs. Cohn have volunteered to make a list of children in the building who are not getting enough to eat and who might be paired with families who might be able to help them get at least one meal a day. We have the good and the bad. Ringelblum believed in telling the whole story and not leaving anything out. And so among the materials that we find in the milk cans, we have an amazing essay written by the Yiddish writer Shia Perle, who some of you know wrote Jeden von der Ganz Jo. Shia Perle was murdered in Auschwitz in October 1943. But in August 1942, at the height of the deportations, Shia Perle saw something that drove him crazy. He saw a Jewish policeman dragging a little 5-year-old Jewish boy to his SS handler and saying, "This is my 5th head of the day." Because the Jewish police were told by the Germans, you have to hand over 5 Jews a day to save your own skin and to save your family. And the Jewish police turned into bloodhounds. The SS man very calmly took out his pistol, murdered the little boy, and as the little boy was dying on the pavement, the SS man said, "This little dog doesn't count as a head. Go and get me an adult." And the Jewish policeman scampered off to get an adult. And Perle came back to his apartment, and in the heat of the moment, he wrote something that I know he never would have said had he survived the war. He said, "What kind of people can produce such bastards, such scum as the Jewish police? Perhaps a people that is capable of producing such garbage is a people that deserves everything it's getting." Now, after the war, all the Jews were Kedoshim. They were martyrs. Perle never would have said this. This is a reminder, by the way, that an important difference between real-time Holocaust writing and post-war Holocaust writing is that the red-hot blazing anger that surged between Jews, directed at other Jews, this is largely censored in post-war Holocaust writing. But imagine, if you will, you're a Yitzhak Katznelson, you're an Avram Levin, you're a Shia Perle. You see Polish Jewry being destroyed. You see the center, the cultural center of Ashkenazi Jewry being destroyed. You don't even know that there will be a state of Israel. You don't even know what will happen after the war. Everything is collapsing, and Jews are serving as bloodhounds for the Germans. And it's easy to be overcome, not just with despair, but with real anger. Now, there's another question that you might want to ask yourself, which is, this was found in the milk can. So clearly Ringelblum read this because he read everything. He could have torn it up. Oh, this doesn't make us look good. I'm not going to allow this to go in. But no, he put it in because he wanted everything to go in. He wanted future historians to trust the archive, believing in its objectivity, because only that would give the archive authority. And Ringelblum racked his brain, asking questions like Perle asked. There were Jewish intellectuals in the Warsaw Ghetto who were saying, this shows that the modern Jew had become morally corrupt. We Jews lacked the moral toughness of our ancestors in the Middle Ages, who could joyfully die for Kiddush Hashem. Jews in the Middle Ages had the anchor of Jewish faith, of Jewish betochen, Jewish security. The modern secular Jew, we left the shore of faith and tradition, and we hope to reach the shore of secular progressivism, and we were stuck in the middle. We were morally disarmed. We were unable to rise to the occasion. We, in fact, became more corrupt than the Poles. Would the Poles have hunted down their fellow countrymen and turned them over to the Germans? No. So this was a terrible debate that was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto, and today is largely forgotten. Ringelblum racked his brains trying to figure out what the answer was. And he finally came to a conclusion that a future historian looking at the Warsaw Ghetto is going to look at the surface, which is, like a boiling kettle with the top of the water sizzling. And that surface is, the bubbles. That's the police, that's the corruption, those are the Gestapo agents. But then there's the real story. And the real story, Ringelblum believed, was what he called das stille Heldentum von dem jüdischen Massenmensch, the quiet heroism of the ordinary Jew. That is, the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Jews who had no money, had no connections, who were all murdered, but who did their best to help their neighbors, help their families, maintain their human dignity. And this is the story that Ringelblum hoped would be told and hoped would be remembered. I'm going to, I guess, have to accelerate my remarks here. How are we doing on time?
Your time is basically up. I know you could probably speak to us for as long as there are pages in each cache of the Ringelblum archive. But I want to leave time for questions, Sam, because I see that people are getting curious about some things, and I want all of our participants to get a chance to ask questions and feel what it's like to talk to an amazing scholar like you. So if you could wrap it up, that would be awesome.
Thank you. Give me five more.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Great.
Okay, so I'm skipping over Ringelblum before the war.
Sam, can you also take your share screen down?
Yeah,
right. Able to see you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I'm just going to show, this is Ringelblum as a young man. This is Ringelblum, his wife and little son, Yuri. This is Yuri and Ringelblum in the 1930s. So in April 1943, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Ringelblum was caught by the Germans, sent to Travniki labor camp, from which he made a daring escape. He comes back to South Warsaw and enters a bunker with 37 Jews. And there he writes literally thousands of pages, including a masterpiece called Polish-Jewish Relations in the Second World War, where he feels this sense of crushing responsibility, the last Jewish historian left in Poland, or so he thought, and he had to get the story right. And so he compares himself to a sofer. You have to go to a mikveh. You can't make one mistake. And he goes out of his way to pay tribute to the problems that the Poles encountered, the bravery that they showed, but ultimately concluding that most of them were taken in by the prevalent anti-Semitism of before the war. On March 7th, 1944, the Germans were led to the bunker by a Polish informer. All the Jews were taken to the Pawiak prison. Yechiel Hirschhout, a Yiddish journalist who survived the war, said that when they heard that Ringelblum was in the Pawiak prison, they tried to hatch a scheme to save him, maybe bribe guards, get him into another cell. Hirschhout goes into the cell and tries to get Ringelblum to agree to this scheme. Ringelblum says he's not going to abandon his wife and son. And Ringelblum by this time has been badly tortured. On March 10th, they're all murdered by the Germans. And anyway, I guess that's where I'll end.
Thank you so much, Sam. Though I've read the book and watched the movie and spoken to you, every single time I hear you, I learn something new. It's like a whole new tradition that there's Teure about pay also. There are things that you know that that aren't written down anywhere, and they come out as we speak. So we're all really lucky to be here. So some people have asked questions on the side, and you can also, for those of you who don't know, if you hit the reactions button at the bottom of the page of your Zoom screen, you can simply click on raise hand, and then I'll call on you. Okay, so I'll start with the questions that we have up. I'd like to, we'll have 3 questions at a time, and we'll let Sam answer those, and then we'll take another 3. So even if you've written your question in the chat, I'd like you to say it out loud so that you can be a part of the conversation. So let's start with Lasha Shakulavshili, who is in Tel Aviv, but is from Georgia, right? Amazing, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Samuel. I've watched the movie A Yiddish World Remembered so many times. It gets deleted sometimes from YouTube, but when it's give this beautiful talk, like explain how they look like, and then so on. You told us so much about creating the archives in Warsaw.
You're breaking up.
Lasha, please turn off your video while you're asking the question so that we can hear you better, okay?
Yeah, so I was wondering, is there any like evidence in Warsaw Ghetto that the Jews themselves tried to encourage the Jews not to believe to what's happening? Because you told the story how 6 people escaped the deportation camps and came back to Warsaw to give like testimonies and say what was happening in Treblinka and in other places. So were there any like movements in Warsaw that encouraged Jews not to believe to these survivors of the deportation camps? That was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, Ringelblum wrote an essay about this, actually, called The Legend of the 10 Lost Tribes. That is, that Jews didn't want to believe the truth, and they spun tales about Jewish camps in Russia. They spun tales of camps in Babruisk and Minsk, where all their loved ones were alive. And he kind of approached this from the point of view of a historian. That is the beginning of rumors, of tales that then spread from one mouth to another. But even after August 1942, there were many people who simply didn't want to believe. Now, that's one aspect. Another aspect is that just before the beginning of the deportations, Adam Chernyakov went from one German official to another asking if it was true that deportations were imminent. And they all said, no, no, no. Am I authorized to speak in the name of the Judenrat and say that all these rumors are false? Absolutely. And so based on these German assurances, the Judenrat spread these stories. But of course, after Chernyakov's suicide, that kind of came to an end. But the fact is that all during the Holocaust, Jews wanted to believe. They wanted to hold on to a shred of hope that even if other people are being killed, we'll survive. In the first week or two of the deportation, The Germans deliberately spread a rumor through Jewish agents like Shmaya Greyer. They spread a rumor that there would be 70,000 people deported, the old and the sick, and then the ghetto would be left alone. And then, of course, there was the mania for getting the proper work certificates. And if you took all your savings, if you took all the dollars that you had hidden and you handed them over to some Jewish macher and he got you a work certificate with a stamp and you thought you were saved, this was a guarantee of life. And then 2 weeks later, the certificate lost its legitimacy. It's not the red stamps now, it's the green stamps. And so this notion of rumors was an essential part of the psychological war. And indeed, not only does Ringelblum write about this, but Rachel Auerbach has a lot to say about this.
Good, thanks. So thank you, Lasha. Thank you, Sam. This time we're going to collect 3 questions and then let you answer all 3 at once. I'm actually going to jump in with the first question, if I could, the first for this round. Could you say something about language in the ghetto, about the changing dynamics between the Polish and the Yiddish languages? This is a topic that Ringelblum writes about, where he says, oh, it's such a shame to hear so many Jews speaking Polish in the ghetto, and everyone. And then Turkov writes about how Yiddish speakers are being forced to perform theater in Polish. And there seem to be, and on the other hand, those who want to work at the Alleenhilf have to work in Yiddish. And there seemed to be a new concentration of Yiddish speakers thanks to because of all of the shtetl Jews being moved into the ghetto. And yet there are all of these different guesses and anxious proclamations about Polish-Yiddish relations in the ghetto. So I wonder if you could say something about that. And now, Ellie Kelman, hi, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Can you voice your question, please? You've got to take mute off. Yeah.
Great. My question was answered in the chat, so thanks.
Well, oh, okay. The question was about, this is a good question though, actually, not the spelling question, but the Gustava Jarecka is very, very interesting. Sounds very interesting. I want to check those out, and maybe you can say a few more words about her, Sam, and also tell us, for all of the many students here, if this is not a dissertation in the making, because it sure sounds like one to me. I would really like someone to write about Gustava Jarecka and all that she wrote and had to say. So if there are no other, I have another question that I received in directly to me about translation. This is from Raful Half. Rafi, could you please voice your question?
Hi, can you hear me? I'm using my cell phone's Wi-Fi. Is it
Thanks
working?
for sharing. Yes, we hear you just fine. Okay.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering if there was any special difficulty in reading and then translating the Ringelblum documents, because since they were written in einem heißen Minute, and since they were written kind of very quickly with lots of stress and pressure, how do you re-express them in other languages without probably detracting from that, that pressure? So how can you spend time translating them, thinking of the right words for expressing them, when they weren't written with time to think about the words they were using?
This is a really good question. And I just want to say, before I hand it over to Sam, this is an especially fitting question for Professor Kassow, because though he is a master historian, he's also extremely sensitive to language and translation and literature in general. So I like that question a lot. Okay, so you've got your 3 questions about Yiddish versus Polish and about Gustava Jarecka. Can someone write a dissertation about her, and about translating language that was written auf den heißen Minute?
Okay. Language in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was a very, very painful It was a very controversial subject. Keep in mind that before the war, acculturation was progressing very rapidly in a city like Warsaw. In Lvov and Krakow, most Jews were already speaking Polish as their native language. By the eve of the war, 85% of all Jewish children were going to Polish government schools, and then many going to afternoon Jewish schools. But the fact is that most Jewish kids were getting their education in the Polish language. By 1938, Arya Tartakover estimated that 25% of Polish Jews were using Polish as their native language, although Chana Shmeruk reminds us that when we look at Yiddish versus Polish, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. It's kind of a polyphonic system where Polish-speaking Jews would go to the Yiddish theater, where the Polish language Jewish press, like Nasz Przegląd, would have pages and pages about modern Yiddish literature, about Hebrew literature. This was not the assimilationism of the 19th century. This Polish language Jewish culture, which was aborning and which was developing very quickly and making very fast strides, not so much in Vilna and not so much where we came from, the Vilna region, but in central Poland, making rapid strides in the cities, the Jewish middle class, Jewish students. All the Jewish high schools in Warsaw used Polish as their major language. But this was a Polish language Jewish cultural sphere which saw itself as Jewish rather than Polish. The problem was that the Yiddish cultural sphere refused to recognize its legitimacy. They saw this as assimilation. Some even saw this as national betrayal. Writers like Zelig Sigalovich talked about the Shmendrikus. Peretz Opaczynski in the Warsaw Ghetto was furious about the Polish speakers, about the Polish-speaking Jews. Ringelblum, Menachem Linder, and others developed an organization in the Warsaw Ghetto called the ECOR, the Yiddish Cultural Organization, to try to fight for the status of Yiddish in the ghetto and to make Yiddish an official language of the Judenrat. The Judenrat's language was Polish. The Alleinhilf's language was Yiddish, and there was a rule that if you worked for the Alleinhilf, you had a deadline to learn how to use Yiddish. And so there was this language conflict within the ghetto. It was, a lot of it was ideological. That is that if you're a real Jew, you should speak Yiddish. And of course, Adam Chernyakov didn't know any Yiddish. He spoke Polish, but he saw himself as a real Jew. There are all kinds of issues here. Another issue that you mentioned were all the refugees coming in speaking Yiddish. That's very true. The problem is that their death rate was very high because by definition, they could have been a Jewish family with means, with money, with savings. The Germans give them 15 minutes to pack and leave their town, and they're dumped into the Warsaw Ghetto. They're put into the refugee centers and they die like flies. Rachel Auerbach was a fervent Yiddishist, but the language that she wrote her diary in was Polish. How do you explain that? It's not easy to explain. One possible explanation is that for someone like Rachel Auerbach or even Emanuel Ringelblum, they get their higher education in the Polish language. They've written their academic works and their dissertations in the Polish language. When sometimes it's actually easier for even Yiddishists to write in Polish rather than to write in Yiddish. In the YIVO archives, the post-war correspondence that Auerbach has with Philip Friedman is in Polish rather than Yiddish. So I think what we're seeing here is kind of a mixture of resentment, ideological competition, plus just a casual polylingualism, which is a continuation of what happened before the war. Some people like Opachinsky were very bothered by it. Shia Perla was very bothered by it. Others accept it as a matter of course. Oh, okay, so I could talk about this for
Yeah,
hours.
well,
but-
we'll continue to talk about it. I know we've talked about it before. I'd
Yeah.
love to pick this up with you later.
Okay.
The next question.
Gustava Yarecka, by all means, she wrote some novels before the war, which would be kind of socialist novels. She, as I said, she was very much associated with the Polish left. If you want to write a dissertation about her, good luck. I don't know how much biographical material there is. There may be, but I don't think a lot survived. But a nice source, the German literary critic Marcel Reich-Ranitzky was in the Warsaw Ghetto during the war. He later became one of Germany's major literary critics. And in his memoirs, he has some amazing stuff to say about her.
Really?
Saying that he fell in love with her, that he fell in love with her, but that, and he.
If you want gossip from the Warsaw Ghetto, only from Sam Kassow.
Right. So, okay. So, if you want to write about her, go ahead. I would get in touch with the specialists in Poland, especially Jacek Liochak, and ask him what he would have to say. Now, what's the last question?
About how to translate this material and respect the stylistic outcome of writing in the moment.
It ain't easy. I mean, first of all, a lot of the material is barely legible, and there are big gaps, even in sentences. You might read the first part of the sentence and the last part of the sentence. Also, I noticed that there were documents written by ordinary people who did not learn how to write quote unquote proper Yiddish. And the orthography, the spelling is very much in, say, an extreme Polish dialect, like Git or Yach. And, again, it's up to the translator to decide what to do with that. Keep in mind that only a tiny proportion of the documents are meant to be literary documents. There was the hope that the Onyx Shabbos would encourage a corpus of literary documents, and Ringelblum asked Auerbach to actually write about this. And but the fact was that most of the writings in the Onyx Shabbos archive are written by ordinary people who are not writers. And Ringelblum encouraged them to write in their own voice and not to engage in literary conceits or literary pretensions. So a lot of this writing is very matter of fact, very ordinary. And that should be the byword of the translator.
Very good. We have a question here from Sophia Schulzen. Sophia, nice to meet you. I've heard all about you from Sam Spinner and from Brucha Kaplan. Sophia, are you here now in Tel Aviv?
I am here in Tel Aviv, although my internet connection is a little bit spotty, so I don't know if it's gonna last through a question.
We can hear you. If you start to break up, I'll ask you to turn your camera off so that we can hear your vocals better. But for now, we hear you just fine. Please go ahead.
Great. So Rafi's question about language made me think about, I've read the Megillas Auschwitz documents, and I know that I think Gradovsky's testimony starts with a message in like 4 different languages, I think like Russian, Polish, French, and German, explaining, not really explaining what the document is, saying that it would be used for future historians or something, because he didn't know if anyone were going to find it. And then the documents themselves are primarily in Yiddish, and they're entirely in Yiddish. And so I was curious if the Shabbos took similar measures with the mitzvahs that they preserved.
Well, all I could say is this, that of the documents that are usable, 50% are in Polish, 45% are in Yiddish, and 5% are in other languages. Was there an intentional policy of putting documents in different languages? No, no. And people were not told, you write this in Polish and in Yiddish. But about half the documents are in the Polish language. So, you know, you think of other examples, like in Auschwitz, they found a French novel. And in the margins of the novel, there was someone from the Lodz ghetto who wrote in Yiddish, in Polish, in English, in French, multilingual. And then when he comes to write in Yiddish, he says, finally, I'm going back to writing in my mama Lashon. I'm going back to writing in my mother tongue. This issue of growing bilingualism before the war is a very, very important one. And we could talk ad infinitum about what would have happened to Yiddish had it not been for the war. Rachel Auerbach, I'm writing, I'm doing this translation of Auerbach's memoirs. And one of the things that Auerbach says is that before the war, she, like many other Yiddish journalists and writers, were very pessimistic about the future of Yiddish. But then working in a soup kitchen and seeing the masses of Jews coming from the shtetls, who mostly died of starvation despite the soup they got, she said that after the war, I realized that the religious shtetl traditional core of Polish Jewry, and keep in mind that 50% of Polish Jews still lived in shtetls in 1939, 50%. Said, I didn't realize, Auerbach said, that they would have kept us going for generations. We could have lived off that capital for generations to come. Yiddish would not have gone under.
Yiddish
It would have
capital.
been, yeah. What?
Yiddish capital. It's
Yes,
an interesting
yes.
concept to play with. Well, thank you so much, Sam. This is a great lecture and a really, really great discussion and a wonderful way to kick off the program. And thanks to all of the students for attending and asking such great questions. And I'll be waiting to see that dissertation on Sofia Jurecka. So somebody's got to go for it. And Sam, I hope we can have coffee in August and talk more about Yiddish versus Polish in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Okay.
Evergreen.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you all. Seid mir gesund. Herzlichen Dank, Shmuel.
Okay, nicht auf was, wir uns sehen in August.
Jo, sollen wir sich treffen. Amen.